on Friday, and we were like, it's been an interesting week. That's kind of how we just talked it. Hasn't been bad, hasn't been good, just been interesting. And I'm excited to bring to you, and actually, Sherry didn't know this, but the songs that she picked kind of work into the sermon this morning. This morning we're going to be in Joshua chapter 4, and we're going to be talking about remembering. And I don't know about you, but I really like seeing different things when you go places and reading the history and the different things like that. I enjoy seeing that, and just even, this is going to sound weird, and I don't mean this in a weird way, but even Cynthia and I went to the cemetery where my mom and dad are buried, and while my brother and sister and I had planned the headstone, I had not actually gotten to see it in person. And so we finally were able to get there a few months ago, and so it was neat to see that, but I found it was weird because I found myself kind of wandering through the cemetery looking at headstones. It's kind of weird how you get stories about people as you look at that. And I know I don't mean that, like I said, I don't mean that in a morbid way. It's just interesting to me. Just knowing the history of it. And you all won't be able to relate to this, but as I was thinking about this, to you all this, and it's wrapped because it's falling apart, and it literally piece by piece is still falling apart. But this is one of the things that, actually it's the only thing I wanted of my grandmother's. When she passed, this was back in '86, she and I, as a kid, this is the little hymnal that we would sing out of together. To me, this is my prized possession, and that sounds kind of weird, but it really is. It's the only thing I wanted of hers. It's the one thing I can look at, and I remember my grandmother, she and I were very close my whole life. And so we always had a very close relationship, but this always brings those memories back to me. And we also, if you've been to our house, we have that big, heavy buffet. Some of you got to carry that thing into the house and are like, oh my God, I never want to touch that thing again. I'm sure those of you who got to be the blessing of lifting that thing, but it's over 100 years old. It's, again, was my grandmother's. It really means a lot to me. It's solid oak, if that gives you an idea of how heavy it is and how well it's made. And it's a backbreaker if you have to move it. But I absolutely love it because every time when I walk into our house, it's a remembrance of my grandmother. And I think the Lord wants us to remember those people and those things in our life that happen. And as we're going to see in Joshua chapter 4, He wanted the Israelites to remember what He had just done for them. And so we're going to be talking about that this morning and the importance of having those remembrances in our life. Because they're the one thing when we're walking through tough times that we can look back at and say, oh, the Lord did an amazing job for me back then, and this is a reminder to me of what He did. Also, we as Americans, and actually probably in any nation, not just Americans, but we have very short memory spans. We don't remember a whole lot sometimes. A few years from now, we'll be like, huh? I don't remember that. Even though we went through it just 5 years before or whatever, we tend to have a short memory span. And so we need those things to remind us that the Lord does work in our lives. If I was to tell you a regret that I have, one of the regrets that I have is that with all the time I got to spend with my grandmother, and I spent a lot of time with her, through the summer, I would almost spend the whole summer with her. That's how close she and I were. And I never wrote down the stories that she told me. I never wrote down some of the history of our family that now is gone. Because my dad, his brothers and sisters are all gone. So there's no one to really go to say, here's our family history. Here's what happened in such and such year. And, you know, just as a recent example, Angela had asked me, gosh, it's been several weeks ago, have you thought about applying to the Cherokee Hospital in Nowata? And we were talking, and I'm like, well, I do have Indian blood, and my grandmother was telling me that I want to say it was her mother was full-blood Cherokee, but there's no proof of that. All of those records got burned up in a fire, and so there's no real record of that, and so I couldn't prove it. But I remember vividly my grandmother talking about that, but there's no history, and I didn't write it down, so I couldn't tell you if I do have Cherokee in me, how much I have. I mean, obviously, through the generations, it's going to be a very small amount, but it's there. I wish I had written it down, and I wish that I had those things I could go back to remember that. And that's one of the things the Lord is telling the Israelites in this passage we're going to read this morning. That they need to remember what he just did. If you remember last week, we talked about the Israelites had come to the Jordan River. And Joshua had given them 3 things they were to do. 1, they were to remember to keep God first in everything that they did. 2, they were to consecrate themselves, to set themselves apart. And 3, to be obedient. And obviously they did, because the Lord worked in mighty ways. They came to the edge of the Jordan River that was flooded. Joshua told the priest carrying the ark, I want you to step into the Jordan River. Kind of a weird thing to ask someone to do, especially with it being flooded, but the priest obeyed, walked out in there, and the water separated, just as it had done with Moses when he set the Israelites free from Egypt. Not only did the water separate, the ground dried up so that they were able to cross on dry ground. And what we're going to read about today are 2 events that happened in that crossing. One is that Joshua went over by where the priest's feet were standing and put 12 stones there as a reminder of what God had just done. He also tells one man from each tribe of Israel to pick up a stone from the bottom of the Jordan River and carry it across into Canaan. And that's where we're going to pick up today. Joshua chapter 4. And we're going to start in verse 4, and we'll read through 11, and then we're going to skip down and read verses 20 through 24. So Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the sons of Israel, one man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, cross again to the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. Let this be a sign among you, so that when your children ask later, saying, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall say to them, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. Thus the sons of Israel did as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, just as the Lord spoke to Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel, and they carried them over with them to the lodging place and put them down there. Then Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan at the place where the feet of the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing, and they are there to this day. For the priests who carried the ark were standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. And the people hurried and crossed. And when all the people had finished crossing, the ark of the Lord and the priests crossed before the people. Then we'll skip to verse 20. Those 12 stones which they had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. He said to the sons of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? Then you shall inform your children, saying, Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed. That all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. There's some amazing verses there that we don't even really stop to think about. You could read right through that chapter and never even stop to think about what happened and what the Lord had commanded them to do. You see, we have to remember the miracle that he's done. Like I said earlier, we tend to have short memory spans, and as we go through the book of Joshua, you're going to see that the Israelites have that short attention span. They kind of, as they get into Canaan, get themselves into trouble because they tend to drift away from what the Lord had told them to do and begin doing what they want to do, and it costs them. Actually, it will come fairly early because after we'll be talking about the Battle of Jericho next week. But right after the Battle of Jericho, they come to Ai and they get defeated because they weren't being obedient to the Lord. So that attention span can be very short sometimes, and we can forget all that God commanded us. And that is what makes those memorial stones even more important to the Israelites, because that is their reminder. And not only is it the reminder that the Lord had just done a miracle before their eyes. And some of these people, some of the Israelites that crossed, their parents and grandparents had told them what the Lord had done for them when they crossed the Red Sea. So they got to experience a very similar situation that their parents and grandparents had before them. But God knew that they needed something to remind them, and not only them, to remind every generation after them as a remembrance to what he had just done. And that's why he tells them, I want you to take up 12 stones from the bottom of the Jordan and carry them across. And then he takes those 12 stones and he puts them together and says, here's your reminder. When you look at these 12 stones, I want you to remember what I just did for you. I want you to remember that I'm always going to go before you, and I'm always going to fight the battle for you. And as long as you do those things I command you, in parentheses, I will be with you, and you will be a successful people. You could then go back and kind of reverse that and say, okay, well, if I don't do that, then God is not going to be with me, and I'm going to have problems. And we'll be seeing